Vintage is a format full of decks casting the best Magic the Gathering cards of all time. A format so powerful you'll find people killing you on turn 1. But in this video, we will be beating them all with Tangle Wire? This is the closest you can get to a prison style strategy in Vintage. It is full of the most degenerate artifact ramp to cast the most degenerate artifact disruption, looking to do it all on turn 1. To speed up our plan, we can also use some of the best lands of all time to either ramp us or also disrupt the opponent. Two cards that you wouldn't typically see in Vintage is Tangle Wire and Patchwork Automaton. The Patchwork is simple, it's a quick clock as every card in our deck is an artifact, and Ward 2 makes it very hard to kill as people rarely play removal in the format. Tangle Wire is a great way to lock out the opponent when they get a lot of moxes on the table or lands. We need an extra hate piece to disrupt them from doing anything. The rest of the deck is full of 1-ofs that are restricted in Vintage because Vintage doesn't really have a ban list, they just restrict cards so you can only play 1-ofs. If you have any doubts about this deck, then watch the whole video because I found it really hard to lose with this deck. To start the first round, we're on the play and we have to mulligan a clunky opening hand, and we keep a very nice 6 that has a lot of degenerate mana and some disruption. I bottom a Mox Emerald as we have a load of mana, and now we can play a turn 1 Sphere of Resistance to try and lock the opponent out of the game. As it hit the table and the opponent didn't have a Force of Will, I'm feeling pretty good about myself until they play a Bazaar of Baghdad. This is one of the best lands in Vintage. All you have to do is tap it to draw 2 cards and discard 3, so there are many strategies that use it like Dredge, Hollow One strategies, Vengevine. There's also a load of Madness cards that you can play with it. This is a scary card. However, with Sphere of Resistance in play, it makes it hard for them to cast Madness spells as they do cost 1 extra, and the Bazaar of Baghdad doesn't make any mana. So they can't cast this Blazing Root Walla, but they do have a follow-up Hollow One, which is free because they discarded 3 cards, so it costs 6 less to cast. As it costs 6 mana because of Sphere, they can't cast it. While we can't deal with the Hollow One, we can deal with the Bazaar, so we just gotta Wasteland that and pass back the turn. From here, the opponent plays a Wasteland, attacks in for 4, and just ships back the turn, and we manage to draw a Strip Mine. From here, the only play is to attack in with our Workshop to try and bait the Wasteland, but they don't activate it, so we play the Tolarian Academy, pass, and they have a Noxious Revival on our end step. Even though Noxious Revival put Bazaar of Baghdad on top of their deck, they decide to Wasteland my Tolarian Academy and play a Strip Mine of their own and attack in for 4 again. Now the game is about to get interesting because we top deck a Smokestack. Smokestack is pretty good in Vintage because people typically do not hit their land drop every turn, or they use cards like Wasteland, which limits the number of lands they have in play to sacrifice, meaning you can force them to sacrifice their premium cards. So I instantly play my land, put Smokestack on the table, and pass back. On the opponent's turn, they play the Bazaar that we knew about, they discard a Root Walla, cast it for 1 mana with the Strip Mine, attack in for 4, and pass back the turn. As Smokestack is 2 individual triggers, you want to make sure that you sacrifice permanents before you put a counter on, so now here I put 1 counter on the Smokestack without having to sacrifice a permanent. And like an absolute beast, we rip Tangle Wire off the top of the deck to lock up the win. As I'm not scared of Bazaar because they aren't able to cast any spells with it, I'm going to Strip Mine their Strip Mine, play the Tangle Wire, and force them to activate the Bazaar on their upkeep. Now we can play the Tangle Wire, pass the turn, and force them to sack all their permanents with the Smokestack. So here in their upkeep, they have to tap up to 4 permanents, and then they have to sacrifice 1, leaving them tapped out for their main phase. From here, the opponent scooped, fair play. Going into boarding, we want all the Phyrexian Revokers out, we want the Graveyard Hate and the Tabernacles, and that's because I thought with Noxious Revival they were implying they were on the Squeevine version. And this opening hand is perfect. We've got Mishra's Workshop, we've got the Leyline, we've got Nettles's, we've got the Patchwork Automaton, but most importantly, we have Tabernacle in our hand. This without a doubt is one of the best cards against the opponent's Bazaar deck, and that's because Bazaar of Baghdad doesn't make any mana, and they put a load of free creatures into play on the first turn. So now we've just got to pray that the opponent puts free creatures into play. The opponent starts off with the Bazaar and just puts 1 Root Walla onto the table, so we can just start off with a Nettlecyst, which is really good because it gets pumped by the Leyline of the Void and the Nettlecyst equipment. From here we pass back the turn, the opponent activates Bazaar again and casts another Root Walla and just passes back the turn. From here we draw Sphere of Resistance, which is a great pickup, so now we can play Patchwork Automaton into Sphere of Resistance to try and really build up a big board. The opponent Force of Wills the Patchwork, so we play the Sphere of Resistance, and they scoop up the game. Going into the next round, we played the same match again, but what made us lose game 1 is they had a Wasteland on turn 2, and a Wasteland on turn 3, and then we just got mana screwed. To put the nail in the coffin, they even had a Chalice of the Void on 0, so we couldn't cast any Moxes to try and get back in the game. Going into the next game, we sideboarded the same as round 1, and we have a very good opening hand with Tabernacle again. I start off the game with a Sphere of Resistance, but the opponent has a counterspell. However, things get really good for us on the opponent's turn. We ended up top decking a Black Lotus to play the Trinisphere to win the game, and in the third game we again managed to get a quick Trinisphere on the table, and because the opponent mulliganed to 3, they really couldn't do anything against our hand. Going into the next round, we have the absolute nuts. What we can do here is play a Mana Crypt, play our Patchwork Automaton, and then play Trinisphere. Pretty insane. Now, if I was actually good at Magic, I would cast the Patchwork Automaton with the Mishra's Workshop, then cast the Mana Crypt to cast the Trinisphere so I get an extra counter on my creature, but let's just ignore that mistake. If you want to see more plays like this, don't forget to subscribe so that you always get notified when a new punt has been uploaded. Anyways, despite this, turn 1 Trinisphere is such a good play because now the opponent can't cast anything. They have to pay 3 mana to cast any spell, and they don't have 3 lands, and they do have to wasteland me here. So now how are they going to get the mana to do anything? They're not going to get the mana to do anything because I'm a beast and I rip a land off the top to play the other Patchwork and force them to scoop the game. Easy, I guess. I wasn't quite sure what the opponent was on, so I just decided to take out 1 Chalice of the Void to bring in 1 defense grid, just as an extra way to protect myself. Going into the next game, we have double Wasteland, Tangle Wire, Moxes. This is the perfect hand, because we can just work around what the opponent is doing. The opponent starts off the game with an Underground Sea and a Preordain, and they top and pass back the turn. Top decking a Smokestack, we start with our Moxes, and then Wasteland the Underground Sea. I then decide to play the Phyrexian Revoker and think for a very long time and decide that I'm just going to name Black Lotus because I have no clue what the opponent is playing, and we have to name a non-land card, so we can't name something like Wasteland. Despite the opponent topping with Preordain, they just pass back the turn. There is a chance here that they just had a Black Lotus in hand. That would be pretty funny. Now they have no permanents in play. I could play the Smokestack with the Mox Pearl, but I decide to be more patient and see what the opponent is on. They play the Orchard land, which means that they're on Oath of Druids, so I instantly wasteland that. They have Ancestral Recall, so we attack in for 2, play our Mox Pearl, and play the Lodestone Golem that we top decked. Now they did have a Force of Will, but that's not too much of a problem here. The opponent continues to do nothing by just playing a Polluted Delta and passing back the turn, so now I think is the time to strike with the Tangle Wire and also attacking in with our Mishra's Factory to just put them on a clock. Because Tangle Wire resolved here, it almost instantly ends the game because Oath of Druids is a sorcery speed deck. They need 2 mana in their main phase to cast Oath of Druids to get the Gristlebrand out of their deck. It just made their life really awkward and they couldn't do anything here to beat me. A Sphere of Resistance off the top put the nail in the coffin, and we move on to the 4th round. The 4th round is super trivial. In game 1 we had a turn 1 Patchwork Automaton into a turn 2 Trinisphere, and the opponent couldn't really do anything. It's really difficult for Vintage players to navigate Trinisphere because their deck isn't designed to pay 3 mana for their spells. Everyone wants to pay 0 mana in Vintage. In game 2 we just got completely out-tempoed with a Pithing Needle on Wasteland and them having loads of basics. We just couldn't disrupt their mana. They had a load of Moxes, so they out-mana'd us, they outspelled us. However, game 3 is one of the most disgusting Vintage games I've ever played. You need to see it. Now, while you could go Workshop, Pearl, Lodestone Golem, I think it's much better to play Workshop, cast Sphere of Resistance. If they counter it, then I can play Mox Pearl and play a second Sphere of Resistance, or if they don't counter it like it happened here, I can just play my Mox Pearl for 1 mana. Now, what's fortunate for me is the opponent just plays a land and passes back. Now here we can put the pressure on even more, playing another Sphere of Resistance, playing our Wasteland, and passing back the turn. We're really starting to squeeze the opponent's hand and make them feel very awkward about the situation because they just have to play another land and pass back the turn. What I find really funny is we draw a Black Lotus and this actually costs 2 mana, so Black Lotus only adds 1 mana as a card here. So what I decide to do is play the Strip Mine and cast the Lodestone Golem, but they do actually have the Force of Will. I would assume that they top deck the Force of Will because you would want to counter one of the Sphere of Resistances, unless they have Hurkyl's Recall in hand, I would assume, but that seems a bit risky. What I find funny is my opponent plays a 3 mana Aether Spell Bomb in Vintage on this turn. I don't know, but now it's time to absolutely destroy the opponent, because what we can do is double Wasteland them, then play the Black Lotus, play the Crucible of Worlds for the exact amount of mana, and then Strip Mine them again, wiping all of their lands and making all of their spells in hand uncastable. To no one's surprise, the opponent scoops. Going into the final round, we are 4-0, playing for the 5-0 defeated run with this deck. Now, I didn't record it, but I had to mulligan my opening 7 here on the play, and we have the absolute Mega Nuts. What I'm going to do is bottom the Tolarian Academy, we have double Workshop, and then we have Trinisphere into Tanglewire to win the game. Now annoyingly, the opponent does have Strip Mine, but we top deck a Patchwork Automaton to put the pressure on, and the opponent just couldn't beat it. All the opponent can do is play a land and pass because Trinisphere is such a broken Magic the Gathering card, and now here I just play the Tanglewire to start putting the pressure on, but the opponent scoops the game. Boarding this matchup, I just took out a Pithy Needle and a Grafdigger's Cage to board in 2 defense grids. Going into game 2, we have a very nice opening hand with Karn the Great Creator and a load of lands. The opponent starts off the game with a land and a Mana Crypt and just passes back the turn. Now I want to ask you to do something please for me, YouTube viewer. Count how many Mana Crypt flips this opponent wins, because this game goes really long. I decide to start off the game with an Urza Saga and the opponent has a way to destroy it on my end step. They untap, win the Mana Crypt flip, and cast a Jace Vryn's Prodigy. Very interesting card to be playing in Vintage, but they play another land, pass back, and we draw a defense grid. The opponent has way more mana than me here, so I decide to play the Tanglewire to try and slow them down to help me develop my mana as well. In response to the Tanglewire trigger, they activate Jace, they have to tap their 3 lands, and they actually win the Mana Crypt flip again, Gitaxian Probe me, and Strip Mine me. On our turn, we have to tap our 2 permanents on the upkeep and find a Workshop. I decide here to actually Strip Mine the opponent because I still want to limit their mana, and the Tanglewire is ticking down, meaning that they have to tap less permanents. We pass back, on their upkeep they flip the Jace, they tap 2 permanents, win the Mana Crypt flip again, that's 3 in a row, and then take their turn. They just plus the Jace, play a basic island, and pass back. We're going to tap our 2 permanents again, and find a Lodestone Golem. Here I think the best play is to just play Defense Grid to try and make sure that next turn we can resolve a good card. The opponent disagrees and just Force of Wills and takes their turn. The opponent taps 2 lands, wins their 4th Mana Crypt flip in a row, plays their land, uses Jace to Gitaxian Probe, and then puts Lurrus into their hand. Finally, Tanglewire isn't screwing ourselves, so we can just tap that, and then we have a lot of mana available to us. As they have Lurrus in hand, I'm going to play the Urza Saga and the Lodestone Golem to try and limit as much mana as possible that they will have next turn. Anyways, finally they lose a Mana Crypt. Oh, no, they don't lose a Mana Crypt flip, so that's 5 in a row now? That is actually insane. Anyways, the opponent pluses on the Lodestone Golem, uses Swords to Plowshare, and then casts this weird card. Essentially, what they can do with it is pay 2 mana and tap it to steal one of my artifacts until end of turn, and it gives it haste. Finally, our Tanglewire has been used up, but we instantly find another one off the top. Wanting to catch up on mana, I decide to play Crucible of Worlds and play an Urza Saga so that we can start using Urza Sagas to fetch all the degenerate mana out of our deck. Don't forget, Urza Saga can fetch Black Lotus, it can fetch Sol Ring, it can fetch a Mana Crypt of our own. Speaking of Mana Crypts, the opponent wins another Mana Crypt flip. I've completely lost count, but the odds of this happening must be very low. The opponent then pluses Jace, steals my Crucible, plays a land from their graveyard, gets Hurkyl's Recall with a Merchant Scroll out of their deck, so we make a token on their end step. We get back our Crucible of Worlds and have to sacrifice our Tanglewire and find a 3rd Tanglewire off the top. As we want as much mana as possible, I float a mana with Urza Saga and go get a Sol Ring out of the deck. Then I decide to play Urza Saga from the graveyard with Crucible of Worlds, again looking for as much mana as possible. I slam the Karn because I know their hand is Hurkyl's Recall and Lurrus, and now what I can do is play the Tanglewire from my hand, attack the Jace, they have to bounce my board, and then I can replay the Tanglewire because of the Sol Ring, completely screwing their mana. From here, the opponent just couldn't win and they actually scooped the match. What a sick league, we managed to go undefeated with this deck and got 11 chests. Of course, for you gambling degens, I'll open the chests at the end of this video, but as always, if you enjoyed this, then don't forget to like and subscribe and check out this video because YouTube thinks you'll like it.